My name is Dr. Stacy Potter, and I will be your host for this evening. Families Connect is a free speaker series offered to our parents, students, staff, and community members with information related to a variety of topics, such as how to support your child in the learning process and recognize strategies to support them at home as well. As a part of the Families Connect series, we invite expert speakers to offer guidance around relevant parenting topics. We also encourage community conversations that are centered around practical strategies to support learning and child development. All right, Neshaminy, here we go. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Robert Brooks to discuss nurturing resilience in ourselves and our children and teens during challenging times. This evening, we will be reviewing realistic expectations for ourselves to practice self-compassion. We will discuss the basic foundation for kids to become resilient and appreciate the importance of empathy while understanding and responding to our children. Dr. Brooks will reinforce a sense of personal control that involves strengthening problem solving and decision-making skills in ourselves and our children, and identify and honor our children's passions and islands of competence. He will also discuss ways to engage in two forms of gratitude and how we may provide opportunities for our children and our Neshaminy families to engage in charitable activities. And lastly, we will discuss ways to create lasting memories that our children will carry with them for the rest of their lives. So before we begin this evening's presentation, I'd like to just review some housekeeping items. First, this is an interactive discussion. Throughout the evening, please feel welcome to ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you cannot see the Q&A button, you just scroll your mouse over the bottom of the window and then buttons will pop up. You can enter your questions there and we'll do our best to answer them as the evening progresses. But if you are not able to have your question answered during our live presentation, we will definitely follow up with you in the near future. After our event this evening, we will also be sending a short survey to each of you regarding the event. Please know that your feedback is very valuable. The Families Connect series is here to support you. The survey only has a few questions and will not take very long to complete. I will also place a link to this survey in the chat section throughout the discussion as we near the end. Dr. Brooks is amazing, as you will see, and will provide a summary of his discussion this evening. You can find the recorded webinar and the summary on our district website, neshaminy.org. The Families Connect link is on the bottom left of the home screen, or you can access it directly at neshaminy.org/familiesconnect. And last, Dr. Brooks has a wonderful website full of resources. At the end of our discussion, I will pull up his website and I will show you how to access some of these resources, so please stay tuned. Whew, that was a mouthful. Thank you for letting me go over these housekeeping items. Again, this is an interactive discussion, so if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A at any time during this presentation, and we will do our best to answer them. And now, I am very excited to formally introduce Dr. Brooks. Dr. Robert Brooks is a clinical psychologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and former director of the Department of Psychology at McLean Hospital, a private psychiatric hospital in the Boston area. He has lectured nationally and internationally and written extensively about such themes as resilience across the lifespan, motivation, learning, parenting and family relations, and creating positive school and work environments. He has authored or co-authored 19 books, including Raising Resilient Children, The Power of Resilience, Achieving Balance, Confidence, and Personal Strength in Your Life, and Tenacity in Children, Nurturing the 7 Instincts for Lifetime Success. He has also received numerous awards for his work. Most recently, the Mental Health Humanitarian Award from William James College in Massachusetts. Ooh, I'm tongue twisted. I'm sorry. William James College in Massachusetts for his contributions as a clinician, educator, and author. Dr. Brooks has also served as a consultant to Sesame Street Parents magazine and completed a videotape and educational guide for PBS titled Look What You've Done, Stories of Hope and Resilience. And that focuses on children and adolescents with special needs. We are so fortunate to welcome you here, Dr. Brooks, and we look forward to your insights into this very important topic.
Well, thank you.
Are you ready to begin?
Yes, and I want to thank you very much. And I also want to say before we begin, Stacy, that it has just been a pleasure to work with you and in planning this and even the format. So thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. And thanks for, again, being such a delight to work with.
I couldn't agree more. I've really enjoyed working with you, and I'm really excited to bring this information to our families. So thank you so much. I just wanted to mention that your vast experience is greatly appreciated, and we really value the time that you've given us this evening. So thank you.
Thank you.
So in your presentation for parents, especially since the emergence of the pandemic, you often begin by emphasizing the importance of self-compassion. Can you describe what you mean by self-compassion and its role in helping both our children and ourselves to be resilient?
Yeah, it seems like all of my interviews or webinars, that has to come first. And I'll tell you why. I've always been interested in this notion of self-compassion. There's actually an article on my website, I think I wrote about 11 years ago. But what was happening is when the pandemic hit and I started to do webinars for teachers and parents and caregivers, there was some interesting reactions. Some people would say to me, "Oh, Bob, I wish I had known this before," or "I think I've really screwed up," or they go on and on. And I started feeling, I think some people are getting more anxious and depressed after they hear me than before they've heard me. Oh, no. And I don't want anyone tonight to walk away saying, "Oh my heavens, I'm feeling more anxious." So it may sound so simple. What I'm going to say is that what has happened in the last few years, and you could even talk about before that, but especially since the pandemic has hit, has been so disruptive that I started saying we really have to have much more realistic expectations for ourselves and our kids. We have to give ourselves a little slack. We have to realize that we do the best we can. I actually more and more started saying, I'm going to start with the assumption that every one of us, our kids and us, that every one of us is really doing the best we can. We may need more information to help us. So I started writing, several of my website articles were about this, about self-compassion. There's a psychologist in Texas, Kristen Neff, who's done a lot of work. And it's a complex concept, but not to overly simplify it, but it basically is be kind to oneself. So as you and I talk about different concepts tonight, what I hope anyone listening will not be saying, "Oh, I wish I had known this," or "I wish I had done this." Instead, you know what? I've done the best I can. I now have some new information. So starting tonight, there's new information I can use. Because if all of us looked at the things that have gone on and our response to it, it's very easy to be very critical towards ourselves and our kids. So self-compassion, I'm going to underline as we discuss the many other concepts, hopefully we will discuss tonight.
And I love that. I love the concept that, nurturing ourselves and giving ourselves a little bit of a break. It's really important to remember.
Yeah, it's critical. I always say, can we take care of our kids or students with the teachers if we don't take care of ourselves? That was even before the pandemic, but I think it's even more urgent now.
Right, absolutely. So as we discuss nurturing resilience in ourselves and our kids, can you describe what this idea of resilience is? A brief description?
Sure. Because I learned as I was editing the Handbook of Resilience in Children, where we had some of the world's experts on resilience submit chapters, that there are different definitions. But it's important then to think about, how am I using the term tonight? And again, just like with self-compassion, not wishing to any way oversimplify it, how I'm going to be using it is basically resilience is the capacity to deal with adversity. It's not that resilient children and adults are not going to face adversity. It doesn't mean they're not going to feel stressed at times. But when adversity comes up, one of the most important things is resilient people will see problems or challenges as things to be solved rather than overwhelmed by. So as we go through this concept of resilience and what we can do, one of the guiding principles is we want to have our children faced with great challenges to think about, how can we solve them? How can they enlist our help? One of the things that makes people very anxious is that I'm thinking about when I spoke with quotes in-person audiences. I would say at this point, how many of you have ever faced a problem and your first thought was, I don't even know where to begin? And Stacy, I quickly raised my hand. If the audience was being honest, almost everyone raised their hands. And then I would say, imagine if almost every problem you face, your first thought was, I don't know where to begin. That's what makes people very anxious. That's what makes people very depressed. So within ourselves and within our children, we want to develop, and I'll talk more about this, obviously, we want to develop this capacity that problems come up. How are we going to solve it? What mindset do we have to have? Because that frees us up to think much more creatively rather than feeling paralyzed of, I don't even know where to start.
Right. I think that's wonderful. And instead of saying, how could I possibly do this? Saying, how could I possibly do this? Right?
It's in one's tone of voice, but it's very important. Look, a lot of the people over the years, I've always seen both children and adults in my clinical practice, and a lot when they first come in, they really are stuck. They, things come up and their problem solving skills are not very good. Their ability to think through different options. So for me, resilience again is to deal effectively with adversity. And to do that, one has to feel that they can solve problems and meet these different challenges.
Right, absolutely. And so you've written that a basic foundation for kids being resilient is having a charismatic adult in their lives.
Yes.
Can you explain that a little bit further?
I would love to, because this is such a key concept. And I hope every parent, teacher, anyone, a caregiver out there hears this. As psychologists became increasingly interested in why is it that some kids facing great adversity as adults were doing relatively well in life. So some of the initial research was psychologists started studying kids who grew up in poverty, who grew up in, unfortunately, homes that were abusive, who grew up in war zones. I've always been interested in kids who struggle in school. So kids who struggled in school growing up. And if you just looked at their childhood and you were to make a prediction how they would turn out, you would say, boy, they have faced great adversity. But yet, why was it that a number of these kids, with all the adversity they faced, seemed to be much more hopeful and optimistic, good problem solvers as they got older? So one way of researching it was researchers asked these adults who had overcome great adversity, they basically said, we could have never predicted, based on how you were growing up, that you would be as hopeful and as resilient as you are today. What do you think was one of the most important things in your childhood or adolescence to help you to be resilient today, to help you to be optimistic? Stacy, in every study that was ever done, bar none, the first answer was almost always the same. These adults, looking back at their childhood, their adolescence, would say, there was at least one person along the way who truly believed in me and stood by me. Even one person, hopefully a number of them, that stood by me. And one of my heroes in the field of psychology, who died about 20 years ago now, his name was Julius Siegel. He lived in Washington, D.C. In the 1980s, he wrote this very brief article that was so important to me. He wrote a lot about resilience, and he said, in research conducted around the world about children of misfortune, that's almost any kid who's faced serious adversity, the ones who make it have during their childhood or adolescence the presence of what he called a charismatic adult. Now, I must tell you, sometimes I almost wish he hadn't used the word charismatic because it seems to have different meanings to different people. But his definition was nothing short of poetic. He says a charismatic adult is an adult from whom, and I love this, it's poetic for me, an adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength. And so it was so important that we now knew that resilience was rooted, basic foundation was rooted in the relationship with one's parents, with teachers, other caregivers. It wasn't just like all of a sudden it came in, by osmosis somewhere. And it was very encouraging because what it also meant to me is there are things we could do in terms of being charismatic adults to help even those, as he said, children of misfortune to become much more hopeful and resilient. And that's why the notion of charismatic adult is so tied to some of the basic research in resilience and the power of the relationship.
So this event this evening is titled "Nurturing Resilience in Ourselves."
Mm-hmm.
Before our children and teens, it's the second part of the title. So I think that's very telling that to become somebody that can nurture resilience in our children, we need to nurture resilience in ourselves. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the questions that we could ask ourselves to become, a charismatic role model for mm-hmm. these children?
Right. And probably tonight, your listeners are going to hear more questions raised. Hopefully I'll answer a lot too, but I love to pose questions. So throughout, I'll be posing questions that help us to think about these. So when you ask the question about to be that charismatic adult, what are some of the things we should be asking ourselves? One of the most common questions, by the way, that I get based on your question is, as I talked about charismatic adults being important to children, I started hearing a lot, and I'm smiling about this. Do we as adults need charismatic adults in our life? Not kidding so much, but I would say unless you've decided to be a hermit, at all ages, we need charismatic adults. And I hope this isn't a quick digression, but a couple questions I often will ask adults is this: who would you list? What 2 or 3, hopefully more, but just take 2 or 3 people who would you list as your charismatic adult today? And what do they say and do to make them that way? And then again, this is for everyone to be self-compassionate. I always love to ask people, who would list you as their charismatic adult? Who gathers strength from you? Because as we go through this interview, we'll see, in order to be resilient, not only do you need people from whom you gather strength, but as you develop and grow, you want people to gather strength from you. So who would be your charismatic adults? Who would list you? And then as caregivers, I love to ask these questions, both in my clinical practice and in workshops I give, is look back at your childhood. What 2 or 3 people, and some people will say, I have many more. I say, what 2 or 3 people would you list as your charismatic adults growing up? And sometimes I'll say in terms of parents or in terms of coaches or in terms of teachers. And then I'll ask, because I like to get very specific, the people you listed as your charismatic adults growing up, what did they say and do to help them become charismatic adults for you? And then always comes, I hope my questions aren't too challenging, because the questions I'm asking now, I've asked myself hundreds of times. I'll say, think about what your charismatic adults said and did with you. And are you saying or doing the same thing with your children, your students? And it's in anything, your colleagues. When I've talked to teacher groups, I said how we have to be charismatic adults and supportive of each other. So what I always try to do, as well, I love the question, is think about, so what are the questions we could ask ourselves, just very personally, that would help us to more and more think about that role of a charismatic adult. And I just find it's been intriguing to me as I learned that concept to think about who were the charismatic adults in my childhood. Certainly, I was very blessed to have 2 parents who were very charismatic adults, but I also had some teachers along the way that I know through college and graduate school made the world of difference to me to help me to be who I am today.
That's wonderful. And so considering this, I'm reflecting as you're talking.
I was
And
almost going to ask you who was your Kevin.
what I was thinking is that it doesn't have to be these huge, grandiose events that form these relationships, right? It can be smaller daily routines, or little incidences where it carries with you, right? And it makes you feel like a sense of belonging.
Yes. A matter of fact, I want to underline what you just said, because sometimes people have said to me, to be a charismatic adult, do you have to be in a child's life for years? Or is it, it's these monumental events? But in research I did, both about parents and about teachers, asking people, what were those moments? I actually said the importance of the seemingly small gestures. And I'll talk about in a moment about micro moments, is I became very interested in how sometimes someone could come into your life, even for a brief moment, and it's not a long-standing relationship, say or do something that you're at that moment very receptive to hearing, and they have served as a charismatic adult. And the reason I said micro moments, in several books I wrote, I talked about, I was impressed with the seemingly small gestures. And just to give you an example from my own life, I had a fifth grade teacher. Most of my teachers wonderful. My fifth grade teacher, I won't even say her name today, because if I do, I'm afraid she'll appear. I mean, she was really fairly abusive. I didn't want to go to the sixth grade. I want to tell the audience this, how a micro moment. I realized I didn't want to go to sixth grade, and I knew I was going to have Mr. Minato. And through the grapevine, who's the grapevine? Friends who were a year older who had Mr. Minato, they said, you're going to really like Mr. Minato. And I still remember this is many years ago, this micro moment. The first week of school, he asked us to draw some things, and I love to draw. And he found the beauty of every kid. He came over, put his hand on my shoulder. Those were the days teachers could put a hand on a shoulder. And he said, Bobby, you have some real artistic ability. We're going to have to put up some of your posters. And I still remember, Stacy, walking home for lunch. And I love when my son said, you went home for lunch. And I said, yeah, well, where I grew up in Brooklyn, every schools were like 3 blocks, away from where you lived. And I still remember saying to my mother, and I bring this up because it was a very emotional experience. As I look back, I came in and my mother said to me, she said, Bobby, you're smiling. Then I realized she hadn't seen me smile at lunch for like the whole fifth grade year. And I still remember saying to her, it's going to be a very good year. And not only was it a good year, how many sixth grade classes have class reunions up to college? Every year we would meet as a class. The reason I bring this up, of course, there were many more moments with Mr. Minato, but that micro moment, that one comment made the world of difference. So I was reading, a lot's been written about microaggressions, but there have been articles. Actually, one was in the Harvard Business Review of all places, but talks about how 1 or 2 moments could really create either a very positive work or school environment or a negative one, and what we call micro affirmations. So I've always said to people, sometimes you don't even know, one comment, one smile, one encouraging remark, how important that could be to help you to be that charismatic adult. So I know I took a little time with that, but I started thinking about what were those micro moments for me,
right,
that started helping me to feel more comfortable with myself. So
what kind of micro moments could we start to pop in as parents? When we only see our children, they come home from school, sometimes
Right.
They have sports, what are some suggestions you have?
It can be very hectic. With younger kids, I've often said to parents, a lot of times we read to the kid at night. I've often said, and this is based on some research I did, asking people about some of their fondest memories, those micro moments when they were growing up. I've often said, when you spend time with your child, especially now I'm talking about younger kids, say, when I'm with you, it's such a special time, wait till you hear this, that even if the phone rings, and nowadays I would say in the last, a decade and a half, even if my cell phone will be off, we're going to continue to play, or I'll continue to reach you. Because I learned from a 7-year-old girl who told me, I know my parents love me. And I said, how do you know that? I mean, she said, because when the phone rings and we're playing, they don't answer it. And that was, for her. I love sports. I coached my sons in basketball for 8 years. And now having grandkids going to events, I am still stunned when I go and how many parents are on their cell phone rather than watching the game. Those are micro moments. I remember when we shared it with about 8 other families. So I would go to 4 games a year. Would take one of my sons to one game. We had season tickets for the Boston Celtics. And it was just those magic moments. But I'll tell you one more. When my sons were in high school, I decided that things are very hectic. I'm working at a psychiatric hospital. I'm often very rushed. Every Wednesday, we would go out for dinner. I would take one. My wife would take the other. It's easy with just 2. We just would go to a hamburger place or something, nothing fancy. It was just nice to get out. So every Wednesday, I would take one or the other. And when my oldest son went off to college, when he came back the first time, whatever it was, some break, in October or so, the first thing he asked me, Stacy, he said, are we still going to do Wednesday dinners? So you knew it was so important. And it would just be the 2 of us chatting with each son. So you create these things, and it's those special times and no interruptions. I mean, we can't tell kids to get off their screen if we're on our screen. And I'll just give one more example. When my grandson was playing soccer, there was a kid on his team, one of these lovely kids, a little klutzy, as we would say, and he scored a goal, and he scored for his team. I always love it when he scored. But I think he was like 7 or 8 years old at the time, and he was so excited. He looked up for his father, and his father was on the cell phone, and you could see the kid just feeling so upset.
Right.
That was a micro moment where the father said, just saying, great, whatever he would say. So what I always say to people, create them, those moments, and alone with each child if you can, families as well. And there are more opportunities than we realize, as busy as we are.
Right. I think that's great advice. I do not want to admit, but I may have been one of those parents checking my phone in the stands. It's so tempting.
I'll say this quietly. I've seen my sons. You know what? Self-compassion, right?
Right.
I know we do it, and I know we're going to do it. And look, you go out to eat. We have a rule if we're out with the grandkids, whatever. Okay, you can have your phone on until the meal comes and we talk with each other. I realize all the stresses and pressures, but even if we could find a few moments, it's really very important. It's funny, when you were laughing, I was thinking, someone said you would take each son alone. I said, half kidding, half not. I think family time is overrated. Have you ever? I said, I remember when the kids were little, they're playing very nicely with each other, and I said, it's time to do something as a family. And you get in the car, and after 2 blocks driving, they're fighting, and you say, if you continue fighting, we're going home, which is exactly what they wanted. Right. So when some of this research I've done about memories is think about, and for the parents listening, or the teachers, think about a Mr. Minato, think about those then as parents, those little moments, just you and a kid about chatting about anything.
Right, absolutely. So another key concept in your writings and in your clinical work in the area of resilience, you discuss personal control.
Yes.
You've written that an attitude of personal control has become even more important with the uncertainties and disruptions brought about by the coronavirus. So can you describe what you mean about personal control and its significance for our students and for ourselves right now?
Yeah, it's another one of those foundations, part of a mindset for resilience. As I describe it, most of your listeners will say, that seems like the Serenity Prayer, which it certainly overlaps with. Basically, what we have found is, not just me, I mean, research shows this, others, children and adults who are resilient, when difficult situations arise, they really look at what they have control over. And I'm going to get more into detail about this. what is it that they can do to meet these situations? People, Stacy, who are not very resilient, when difficult situations arise and challenges and adversity, they often adopt, oh, why did this have to happen to me? Or why did this have to happen to my child? And a lot of people also who do not have what I call personal control, they hold grudges for 30, 40 years, waiting for someone else to change first. They're always thinking a lot about regretting things. And why this becomes very important, it's very natural if there's some difficulty in our lives to say, why me or why my child? But if that mindset continues, what that develops is what we call, mental health, a victim's mentality. So, a matter of fact, one of my favorite books about this is, which I would highly recommend. It's one of those books I've read since graduate school about 6, 7 times. It had such an impact. Is Viktor Frankl's book called Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor. The reason I bring that up, the first half of the book is about his experience in the concentration camps. And he has some of the most poignant, powerful descriptions. And one is, he said, even in the concentration camps, there were a few brave men and women who would give away their last morsel of food to someone who was even more hungry than they were. They proved the Nazis could take anything away from you but the last of the human freedoms. To choose, and this I want to underline, to choose your attitude, your response in any given set of circumstances. He says that about a concentration camp, that what we have control over is our attitude and response. Why it's become so important then, we may have had no control over COVID or whatever, but what we have to help our children look at is, okay, how do we respond? And I know we'll be getting into some very specific ways to respond. How do we respond? What's our attitude towards this? It's been so disruptive the last few years, but I was talking about personal control for the last 25 years, but it's been so disruptive that it really weakened the sense of personal control because it's been so unpredictable. But even then, one could say, okay, different things are arising. How will I behave as a parent or a teacher? How can I help my child to think about how they will respond, how they will cope? I talk a lot about how do we help our children to cope. And there's, again, just, some wonderful research on this. Just to give you one example, there was a psychologist who studied adults who struggled in school, who had learning problems. And he had 2 groups of adults, both of whom had learning problems growing up, significant ones. One group was doing very well as adults, the other was not. Do you know what he found is the main distinction between them? The ones who were doing well long ago stopped saying, why did I have to be born with a learning problem? Instead, they said, basically, I had no control over having a learning problem. What I have control over is my attitude and response to it. The ones who were doing poorly, they could be 60 years old. They could say, my life would have been so different if I didn't have a learning, problem in this regard. So I'm smiling again. I smile easily, but I'm thinking of all my patients, especially my teenage and adult patients who would say to me, Bob or Dr. Bob, I know exactly what you're going to say. Do I have any control of this? And if I don't, then I have to find another way of handling it. And I'm not saying any of this is simple at all, but it's another way. And I'll just this last thought about that. This is where also problem solving comes in, because if you want kids to develop a sense of personal control, what they have control over, then they also, this is how everything ties together, they also have to feel that there are ways of solving problems. And it's really been a basic concept for me about, do we have control over this? And I have to look at myself. We all do. Am I practicing an outlook of personal control?
Right. I actually have 2 questions from the audience that directly relate to this. Just backtracking a little bit about charismatic adults.
Mm-hmm.
We were asked, is it possible that this could be reciprocal? Can children be charismatic influences to their adults and help foster our strength as well?
Yes. I love that question, because some people have said to me, I've gotten into some nice discussions. How could a child be a charismatic adult to you? But you know what's really been interesting, and you could view it as a parent and as a therapist. Certainly, there have been some kids. I'll stick it as a therapist. Some kids I've worked with, where I have been so amazed by their courage and what they are willing to do, that they're a source of strength for me. And not only that, their discussions with me have taught me so much. It might sound trite, but I know a lot of therapists I hope would agree that sometimes we learn more from our patients than maybe they learn from us, and we learn more for our children. So why I love that question is sources of strength can come from different places. I mentioned Mr. Minato. I could tell you about a coach I had, when I was in middle school, playing Little League. Well, in New York City, it was called Police Athletic League. The police actually organized it. But I really have been, I could think right off the top of my head about several kids I've seen in therapy. And with my own sons, some of whatever adversity they faced and how they handled it. So, yeah, sources of strength could come from different people of different ages in that regard. Now, not everyone might agree with that, but certainly based on my personal experience and the different roles I have in life, I would say yes.
And I would imagine, I love this question also, because I would imagine then recognizing it and communicating it would empower our kids to say, hey, you just taught me this, or you just helped me get through this. It's a really wonderful thing to give back, to put it in their realm of control.
Yes.
Hey, wow, I could help an adult,
I love what you said, because we'll get into later about feeling you're helping others. But actually, as a therapist, especially with kids in elementary school, I actually had like a little diploma I made, assistant therapist or assistant psychologist, and they would have it. I couldn't do it with my teenage patients because they wanted part of my fee, but I'm kidding a little, but I would say I learned a lot from you. You have to be genuine. Kids know if you're not, but I learned a lot from you. That was very helpful for me. And it's true. So sources of strength could come from, certainly people of different ages. It could be someone you're very close to for years, or someone you just meet and they come into your life for a brief moment, but they have a major impact on you. So it's really a wonderful question. That's why when Siegel used the term charismatic adult. Well, when I actually do some exercise about it, I say, but adult doesn't necessarily have to be adult in terms of age. It's just that concept of charismatic adult. So whoever wrote that, I'm very pleased that they did that question.
So the next question, I think it fits in with the realm of control, personal control. So there is a parent that's asking if they are currently going through a separation and they do not have contact with their child, but they still want to show, how important they are to that child. Do you have any advice for this parent?
Yeah, I know we're going to get some questions that unless I had more information, it would be difficult to answer, because if they have no contact at all, if there's a legal issue involved, first you have to deal with the legal issue. I mean, I've known in some cases, sadly, that one parent is not allowed to see the children for whatever reasons. If not, by the way, it's almost something, and again, I wish I could, just answer more, but one really needs more information. It's something that if in fact one is not seeing a child and is kept from seeing a child legally, they really have to, consult with a lawyer in that case. Now, if they work it out that they can see that child, then when I work with parents who say one who does not have custody, doesn't see the child that often, we talk about under what circumstances would it be best to write a note. Nowadays, FaceTime call or even Zoom call, but again, it's within the parameters of are there legal issues going on that you really have to first make sure that those legal issues are addressed.
Thank you. And I will, that parent has asked me to forward you their information. So I will do that. And maybe you two will touch base,
Okay.
after our event. So thank you very much for that question. I know that was a difficult question, but
Mhm.
thank you. And I appreciate the confidence in hoping that we can guide you in the right path. So that actually brings us to this idea that caregivers and charismatic adults, we really need to practice empathy, right? We need to put
Yes.
ourselves in the shoes of whoever is going through the situation, whether it is a child or another charismatic adult or a colleague.
Mhm.
So tell us about the role of empathy in parenting and caregiving. And I know you've posed questions for parents to consider to help us be more empathetic. If you would like to expand on some of these
Sure.
questions, it'd be great.
Yeah, in terms of how do we, what helps us to be a charismatic adult, I've talked a lot about empathy, again, without, like with the other concepts, also not wishing to oversimplify things, but really the capacity to put yourself in the shoes of another person and see the world through their eyes. So let's think of it in terms of a caregiver with a child. One of the things is I've been talking about empathy a great deal. About 20, I can't believe it, about probably 26 years ago, a psychologist, Daniel Goleman, wrote a book that had quite an impact on me. It was called Emotional Intelligence. And then he wrote a book called Social Intelligence. And when he wrote a book about emotional intelligence, which he called EQ, he said that is often as important, if not more important, than IQ, what you do on an intelligence test. And what he said is one of the most important components of emotional intelligence is empathy. And emotional intelligence had to do with our relationships with others and different skills. So I started saying, it was just reinforcing what I'd been writing about anyway. It's really difficult to be a charismatic adult if you cannot put yourself inside the shoes of, I'll stick with kids right now, the children you're seeing. And parents totally agreed with me. And then they started asking some questions. And the questions were this: what should we be thinking about so that we can be more empathic? So that led me to think about some questions, get feedback from parents and teachers. So I'll share with the audience now some of the questions that parents and teachers and other caregivers have told me were very helpful to them in having a more positive relationship with with a child or student. One is, what words, I tell people, you get a pad of paper, what words do you hope your kids or your students use to describe you? And I say you could keep it to just 3 or 4 words. What are the key words that if I interviewed your kids and asked them to describe you, what words would you hope they use? And I should note that with some staffs, I'll actually do this at a whole staff meeting. So it's very interesting to hear the different words. Then, Stacy, comes the next question. And the next question is one that is so vital for me. Once you have those words, I then ask, what do you say and do on a regular basis? So that, and I'll even emphasize this word, what do you intentionally say and do? Because I think we have to be intentional. We have to be spontaneous, but we also have to be intentional. What do you intentionally say and do on a regular basis so that your kids are likely to use the words you hope they use? And then the third question, what words do you think they would use? And how close are they to the words you hope they would use? And just to share with your audience, at this point, I was speaking, again, pre-pandemic, to a group of about 200 parents. At this moment, something happened. I'm glad it doesn't happen often, but it turned out to be funny and poignant at the same time. All of a sudden, I mentioned these questions. This woman just says, "Oh my God," just shouts it out. And I thought there was a medical emergency or something. She said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And then she looks at me and said, "But Bob, those are good questions." Well, any speaker wants to hear that their questions are good. I said, "Thank you." And she said, it's just like me and her and 198 other people listening in, said, the first word I hope my kids use to describe me is calm. And I said, calm. Do you think they will? And, she has this big smile. I said, do you think they would use that word? Just like this. I always wish I had a tape, because she said, so I said, you think they'll use the word calm? Not at all. I've been yelling at them for 11 years. I don't think that's the first word that would come up. But afterwards, she came up to speak with me and she said, I never really thought about how my kids would describe me. I never really thought about how I intentionally say or do things. And she wrote me afterwards also, she emailed me, and she said, those are very important questions. They may sound very simple, but how would we like our kids to describe us? How would we like our students to describe us? Listen, same thing, you do in terms of marriages. How would you like your spouse, partner, whatever describe you? That gets a little more dicey. But anyway, it's in any relationship. When we interact with someone, they're going to have words to describe us. By the end of, even now, by the end of this interview, anyone listening will have words to describe me. That's why I have to really meditate before I go on, but it's true. And what do you want them to be? And you know what? We're not perfect. So but Daniel Goleman was so right when he said empathy is a key component of our relationships. And that's why I say it's a key component of our being those charismatic adults, to think about how we come across, how we behave towards others so that they gather strength from us.
And I think that in public, it's a little bit easier to be a little bit more empathetic than when you're at home and you're like, let's go, move it.
Oh, so, yeah.
It's not easy. But what are some of the obstacles that we may need to overcome to
okay. Because here I am, supposedly an expert on, on empathy. I'll put that expert in quote. You know what I discovered? And this is going to sound, I know, very simple. It's very easy to be empathic when the other people agree with you. It's very easy to be empathic towards your children when they do whatever you would like them to do. It's very easy to be empathic when your kids wake up every morning and say, we are so fortunate to be a member of this household. If they do, be suspicious. The true test of empathy, Stacy, is to be empathic when you're upset, annoyed, or disappointed. And I'm going to give an example that for years I could not give, but I feel comfortable enough now. When my older son, Richard, and I'll just say this, he's very successful today, wonderful person, but he did no work in school in the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th grades. Now, I was lecturing all around the country on how to motivate students. Every one of Rich's teachers had taken my workshop on how to motivate students. And he wasn't doing his homework. I may be the only parent who ever received a warning slip where I was quoted on the warning slip. The teacher was trying to be nice. He said, Bob, I think this is part of the adolescent rebellion you told us about. And I said, the heck with the adolescent rebellion. He's going to do his work. Now I'm going to give you a very interesting example. So for 4 straight years, except for summer breaks, here I am working at a psychiatric hospital where I'm Dr. Empathy. The moment I came home from work, and I'll ask, but I'll fill in because with the live audience, I'll say, could any of you guess what was the very first question I asked Rich the moment I walked in? And a lot of people could, Rich, did you do your homework? Yes. And why would you ask for 4 straight years the first question if you did your homework? Right away, there was tension in the house. Right away, you could feel the distance between me and Rich. And I'm so embarrassed to say this because I often say personal control. If you're doing the same thing over and over again, it doesn't work. Why do you keep doing it? But right. You know what it was? You see, I was embarrassed to tell you this. My thought was, this kid has to change. This kid has to change. And I must tell you, it was very painful. I could kid about it now. I often will say to parents, of all the experiences you've had as a parent or the teachers watching, what are 1 or 2 of the best moments you ever had as a parent? What made them so good? What is 1 or 2 of the most difficult moments, worst moments? What made them so difficult? But what did you learn from both? I would say that was the most difficult day was when I told myself, don't ask Rich if he has done his homework. And the moment I walked in, I started to say it. And he walked away from me, this very loving kid. And it was almost like he was saying, I'm out of here.
Right.
And I remember saying to myself, you're such a fraud. You talk about family relationships and parenting and all this positivity. And in your own home, your son doesn't want to be with you anymore. Now, let me get specifically to empathy. What does empathy have to do with all this? A truly empathic father would have asked after what? 2 weeks, 3 weeks, not 4 years, this question. I wonder how my son Richard experiences it when the first thing I ask him when I come home is, did you do your homework? See, if I
Right,
had
that's
asked that
true. Yeah.
question, if I'd asked that question, I would say it's getting nowhere. I mean, I say to parents, of course, now many of us work at home, but before the pandemic, how many of you would like it if the moment you came home, the first thing your kid said to you is, did you finish all your work at work today? Of course, if you didn't, there's no television for you tonight. And if you worked a little harder, we could live better. And parents will laugh, but that's how the kid experiences. And before I leave this topic, my wife says, if you tell a story about you and Rich, please tell people you and Rich are extremely close today. Rich and I are extremely close today. Okay. My wife likes me to tell that story because how we got close was totally her idea. She's not even in the field of mental health, but it was after she read one of my books. So she actually followed what I wrote in my book, and I could not. But why? When you're upset, annoyed, or disappointed, it's very easy. You just want to get your point of view across without thinking about how is that being experienced here.
Right. And a question came in from the audience that I can empathize with. Is it normal for teens to be in their room all the time? And I think I can relate to this. And how do we get them to interact with the family more? So you answered it a little bit, but is this a normal thing?
Well, it depends to what extent. I'm laughing only because I can think of my kids going into their rooms as teenagers. I always like to take an overall view of a kid. When parents tell me their kid's in the room all the time, they have no friends, and all of this, you have to look at the overall life of the kid. But we do know it's more difficult than when my kids were growing up before the internet. We do know that kids like to go in their room, they FaceTime with friends or, whatever it may be. I think as parents, we have every right to sit down, problem solving with our kids and say, we really do have to spend some time together, even if it's just eating dinner together. I was very fortunate that as hectic as my schedule was, Stacy, that I made it to dinner almost every night. I could schedule it. I always had an office in my house, so I could see when my kids were little, see patients after I helped put them to sleep. But I think when parents ask the question that came in, which is so important, I also want to know about the kids' overall life, what their relationship is like with you, what it is with friends, how are they doing, in school and things like that. So it's not just an isolated thing. If the parents say my kid is doing fine, they have many friends, a lot of the hours are spent with friends, I still think we can think about how, as a family, what time do we spend? And once they're teenagers, the reality is, I hate to say it, it's not that they love us. I always say to parents, they're your kids. They may not show it. The love is much, but to be there. And I think we can set up certain times that we should be together as a family. Now, I said before, I think family time is overrated. It could be with my sons. I found it was much more, I'd say, powerful when I spent time with each of them alone, whether it was going to a Celtics game or out just for dinner. So I'm sure I didn't solve that person's problem, but as for them to think of the overall life of their child right now.
Right. And also to think about, and I try to remember this at home, because I also have teenagers, boys. They just need some space sometimes.
That's right.
They are, on the go all day long, going through school, around everybody. Sometimes they just need to decompress. And I'm trying to respect that. Reflecting on my own home life.
We need it even as parents.
Right.
I used to welcome, working in a psychiatric house, I used to welcome that it was only a half-hour drive home. I know some people don't. I could decompress. And my wife used to laugh about this, especially during the cold weather. I would come home. The first thing I did was get out of my, quotes, work clothes and put on PJs, especially it was like, I'm home now, I can relax. And that really signified it for me. So we even need some of that time. And I always welcome that drive home just to think about what went on, to prepare myself, then not, except with Rich, that you do your homework, to really then be much more available to my sons.
Right. Absolutely.
And my wife.
Thank you so much for that question. I know we can all relate to it. So moving on, in the 1980s, you had introduced the concept of islands of competence as part of a resilience framework. And you have written the introduction of this concept, that it was reflected in different kinds of questions that you can ask parents, teachers, and other caregivers. What are these islands of competence, and what are the questions your parents, have about these islands?
Yeah. What happened was, I just want to give a little history about this and why this came about. As I reflect upon what did I learn in my career, what was some of the things? I think one of the big mistakes I made at the beginning of my career, and by the way, it's part of the process of learning to be a therapist. I felt parents came in to see me because of problems that kid was having. So I thought it was important for me to discuss these problems that the kids, were having. When I went up to school to consult about kids, I was asked, schools called me about consulting with kids, or if it was my own patient, they didn't call to discuss kids who were doing very well in school. It was always kids who were having problems. And what happened is I could meet with parents for a couple hours to discuss why they were coming in. And I realized 98% of the conversation had to do with the problems their kids were having. I could go up to the school and spend the same amount of time talking about kids' problems. And what I discovered, it's this self-reflection. I said, I'm getting depressed after a lot of these meetings. And then I said to myself, it might sound so simple now, especially since I write about resilience in a strength-based model. I said, what would happen if after just 10, 15 minutes, I would say to parents or teachers, now that I've heard about some of your son or daughters or students' problems, what do you see as their strengths? And I had this image. It would take me too long to explain. Another way of saying areas of strength. What are their islands of competence? Because I felt many of the kids I was seeing in therapy seemed to be drowning in an ocean of inadequacy. That was the image I had. And I said, I don't know what's going to happen, but I really am going to ask that question. Well, it was one of the most important things I could do, because what I found is when I started asking parents and teachers, what is this child's or student's islands of competence? As they started to talk about it, it was like broke away from a negative mindset. And then I said, I wonder what if I ask kids what they see as their strengths, their passions. Some kids, interestingly enough, Stacy, they said, I don't know. But I would say to them, then we have to figure out what they are. And I more and more felt I will never be able to help a child with his or her problems, or have parents help, or teachers, if we can't specify what their beauty and strengths are. And I just want to give a couple of examples, because it's not just identifying islands of competence. It's also reinforcing and honoring them. So just to give you some real life examples, I was referred to a 7-year-old boy. He had some learning problems and somewhat of a shy kid. And the parents were concerned in terms of just relationships, whatever. And the father and mother came in, lovely people. Before I became a parent myself, it was very easy to blame parents if the kid had a problem. And the father, I really could, there's something about him. I really felt for him. He said, Bob, before my son was born, I had this image that just like with my father, I love sports. My father loved sports. That we go out, we toss a football or baseball. And he said, my son has no interest in sports. I mean, the kid's only 7. And father said to me, I almost feel like I'm losing him. So I then said, it was both parents, but this conversation was really focused on the father. I said, well, what do you see as your son's passions, strengths, his islands of competence? Both parents both quickly said, he loves to draw. He's really a very good artist. And then father, very depressed looking, said, and I hate to draw. I wish he would play sports. And then came, those moments when you're a therapist where you say, I'm so glad I became a therapist. Because father says, Bob, and again, the kid's only 7, I feel I'm losing my son. The connection between us. And I said something to the father, and I'm going into detail because any parent listening has to think about how they relate to their kids. I said to the father, one of the things I've learned is, especially as kids are young, as they're developing, we have to accommodate more to their interests than they're going to accommodate to ours. And you don't have to lose him, but you have to think about how you're going to relate to his strengths, his interests. The next day, father called me. And he said, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said about islands of competence. And he said, I just signed my son and me up. He's so excited for an art class in one of the museums in Boston. Father called me after the first art lesson, if you will. And he said, he was really choked up. He said, you know, Bob, he said, watching my son draw and the excitement and happiness, he was so joyful. And then Father really choked up. You could tell he was holding back tears. He said, it was so joyous for me to see that. And then he said, and you know what? I was having trouble drawing. And my son said, maybe it's the way you hold a pencil, Dad. But it was one of those beautiful moments. Mm-hmm. And what I use that example because I've also worked with parents. And I saw with me and Rich, why can't the expert on motivation have a kid who seems to be motivated? He was motivated, but not about other things. Not every kid is going to be the best athlete in the world. Not every kid's going to be a social butterfly. And one kid I saw was his main island of competence. He loved to garden and take care of plants. And his parents thought that was ridiculous. And I had to work very hard with the parents, but that's his joy. And, you know, again, it was parents who were very good academically. Their son was not. They were social butterflies. Their son was not. And again, I'm not saying anything that this is easy, but if a kid looks in our eyes and what they see is disappointment, especially about the activities that bring them a sense of dignity, we're going to have a great deal of difficulty. And that's why I started saying to parents and to teachers, what do you see as your child's passions, their islands of competence?
Right. I think that's really important to remember. Definitely. And then if we think about these islands of confidence and resilience, and, you know, in our children, and we think about resilient kids, you know, is it fair to say that they're resilient because they effectively deal with mistakes and setbacks, and they're not afraid to take risks? And if that's true, how can we as parents foster a positive attitude towards these mistakes and failures?
Yeah. Again, I'm sorry, a very important question because one doesn't need research for what I'm going to say now. I mean, we see it every day. Kids who are resilient basically see it's like I mentioned right at the beginning, problems as things to be solved rather than overwhelmed by. So kids who are resilient basically see setbacks or mistakes as things from which to learn. Kids who are not resilient, and a metaphor I've used in many of my writings, Stacy, kids who are not resilient see every mistake like a rock around the neck, which weighs them down more and more and more. And any parent listening knows that when you see your kid who is so upset by mistakes, that it's very painful for us. And see, when mistakes come up, all of us, every one of us as adults, as kids, we use different ways of coping. Some ways of coping are very positive. We make a mistake. What can we learn from it? But a lot of the kids I've seen in therapy, the ones who are not as resilient, they will quit at things. They won't even try things. They'll blame others, talk about personal control instead of saying, what can I do differently? How can I learn? It's a bad teacher. It's a bad coach. It's bad this. So as I more and more wrote about resilience, I somehow saw it included in every one of my books. How do you help kids deal with mistakes? And I started asking parents, here are more questions for parents to consider. I started to say to parents, and as I bring these up, I'm a little hesitant, but again, getting back to the first point, self-compassion. I started to say to parents, we are models for our children in dealing with setbacks and mistakes, whether we realize it or not. So here are several questions I started asking. And I'm sharing with our listeners questions that parents have told me, feedback I've gotten that they found helpful in terms of as they navigated the world with their child. First question I would ask is, if I were to interview your kids and ask them, how do they observe you as parents handling mistakes or setbacks? What would they say? Now, in the ideal world, I wish every kid would say, oh, you know what? They're great problem solvers. Whenever something doesn't go right or they make a mistake, the first thing they say is, what could we do differently next time? How can we handle it differently? Now I'll tell the listeners' actual comment. They scream, they yell. One girl said to me, they say words they tell me not to say. But my all-time favorite, it was about a 9-year-old boy. I said, when your parents make a mistake, like, what do they say or do? Just like this, very innocently. What's a double martini? Now, this is not a very good model there. So we have to think about, what do our kids observe, how we deal with mistakes? Second question, and these are, again, I'm emphasizing this, these are questions that then, after parents have heard me speak, have actually asked themselves. If I asked your kids, how do you handle it when they make mistakes? What would they say? Again, I wish every kid the ideal, and I know we can't be the ideal. Dr. Brooks, when I make a mistake or, something doesn't work out, they'll always come over and say, let's figure out what we could do differently or how we can handle it differently, whatever it would be. Now, here are some actual ones. They scream, they yell. One boy, I had barely finished the question, and he said this to me. He said, and he started to tear up. He was probably a 10-year-old boy. He said, they say words that hurt me. And I said, what do you mean? And he says to me, should parents say things that hurt you? And I wanted to be empathic. I said, sometimes parents will say things and they're upset and whatever. And so I said, what did they say? And he said to me, they'll say things like, why don't you use your brains? And I was giving a workshop, and I used that example. A mother in the audience said to me, is it really that bad to say you got to start using your brains? And I said, think of it this way, being empathic. Imagine if you were out with your husband or some friends and you made a mistake. Imagine if they turned to you and the first thing they said is, another mistake? You really have to start using your brains. I said, be honest. Would you say to them something like, that was very helpful, very supportive, thank you so much? But we say these things. And when kids feel they're being judged for their mistakes, instead of adopting a problem-solving attitude, after a while, they're going to find ways of coping that I just say are counterproductive. They'll quit at things. They'll make excuses for things. They won't be able to be resilient. The resilient kids and adults basically do feel, I can learn from this. Again, I'm not saying any of this is easy, because there are times we face things and those self-doubts come in, but we want to help our kids at those moments. What we're doing sometimes is creating micro moments, those precious moments around making mistakes.
Right. And I think it's important to think about, how can people handle mistakes if we do not allow them to make mistakes?
Yes.
Practice handling those
mistakes. Excellent point, because it also gets into the other side, parents rushing in to protect a kid. So, I've always said, and I love the point you just made, I always said, you don't want to throw a kid in 10 feet of water if they can't swim, but you better start letting them get their ankles and knees wet. And my wife's sister, she was a high school teacher, and she would tell me examples where parents would come in and actually ask her to change their kids' grades, not because the kid deserved a higher grade, but it will look better when they apply for colleges. And I affectionately say, I love my sister-in-law, nice, tough cookie in the right way, as to use language from my New York days. She would say, I'd love to give your son or daughter a higher grade if they earn it. Mm-hmm. Because what does it say to a kid if we rush it? This is the other side of the coin. And it's basically saying to them, we don't think you can handle it yourself. So we have to come and rescue you. And it's false. And kids know it's false in that regard. So the key thing is, it's with the point you make, we're all going to fall down. We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to experience rejections. It's how do we handle it? And as kids growing up, how do the adults in our life assist us in handling it effectively?
Right. And on a personal note, I learned this year, my son, my youngest, he's in 7th grade, said, you know why I don't like to tell you about everything in my day, Mom? And I said, what's going on? What do you mean? I thought you told me everything. It's because you always have to fix stuff. He's like, sometimes I just want to tell you, and you don't need to do anything. And that really made me pause and say, wow, I need to take a break, let him handle things, and give him an opportunity to show his resilience.
Wow. What a perceptive. That's very perceptive, but it's important. I had experience, I think it was with Rich, actually. He asked me, one time he actually allowed me to look at an essay he was writing. It may have been in the 7th grade. And so I'm making corrections, and he looks at it, he says, I can't use your corrections. No seventh grader writes like this. And of course, I'm being the editor I was at my college newspaper saying, he's right, in that regard. So with yours, I'm telling you, and you brought up another very important point there is, and I've seen this in relationships and all kinds of relationships. Sometimes people want to bring something up, not for the other person to solve it, but just to listen and to be able to be empathic towards them. Sometimes none of us wants to see our kids in pain. So we think, what could we say or do to lessen their pain? But then, of course, sometimes, unfortunately, we have the message, you can't handle it, so I have to come in. Right. Even though we may be very well-meaning.
Right, absolutely. And I did definitely learn that lesson recently.
See, we learn a lot from our kids.
Yep. So, some final thoughts. You stated that another component, you've been hinting at it throughout our discussion, is this idea of the involvement in charitable activities,
yes.
Contributory activities. Mm-hmm. And you said that the involvement in these activities not only nurtures resilience and hope, but also empathy and compassion and responsibility. Mm-hmm. And all of these are very important attributes. Can you describe or give some examples of the role of contributory? Oh, I can't say the word. Contributory.
Now contributory.
Contributory.
Just charitable.
And charitable activities.
Okay. Just a very quick background. One of the first books I ever wrote was a book basically about school climate. And I was asked by the publisher, said, you've been writing a lot about schools. This goes back a number of years. If you were to create a school, what mindset would you like to see in the teachers as well as the kids? So as part of it, I did this, I'll call it informal research that I was giving, as I was giving workshops and talks around the country, I gave out a one-page questionnaire. I started saying, what do we remember about schools? Let me see people's favorite and worst memories. I only have time to go into the favorite. So the first question on the questionnaire, Stacy, was, of all the memories you have of school, what is one of your favorite memories? And I wanted to see the impact of a, quote, charismatic adult at the school, something an adult at the school said or did. And I use words like this that boosted your self-esteem, your motivation, and your dignity. And I was surprised by one of the most frequent answers. Now I'm wondering why I was surprised. One of the most common, frequent answers of a positive memory that boosted their sense of dignity and motivation was when you were asked to help out. I got things like, I remember when a teacher asked me to pass out the milk and straws. I remember when a teacher asked me to tutor a younger child. So I said, this is the most positive memory. So in my book, Raising Resilient Children, I make a statement. I hope everyone would agree with it. I think there's an inborn need in children to want to help. When they're 3 or 4, can I mow the lawn with your dad? Can I do this? And you find ways, not necessarily mowing the lawn with electric lawnmower, because then parents will say they don't want to help anymore when they're 10 or 11. But what they are doing is often wanting to help a friend. But it's not just, I want to really emphasize this. What I learned, it's not just kids. There's wonderful research to show through our senior years that what really contributes to resilience is a sense of purpose and meaning. And one of the things that really helps with that is when you feel you're helping out. So I started to say to parents, if your kids are young, instead of saying, remember to do your chores, I know it may seem simplistic, say, I could really use your help. This doesn't mean your kid is going to say, oh, I'm so anxious to help you. But put it in those terms. When I go into schools to consult about a kid who's struggling in school, one of the first questions I ask, in addition to islands of competence, is what is one thing this child does at the school that makes him or her feel that they're making a positive difference? I mean, I remember, the boy with the gardening, who I mentioned, who parents couldn't accept. At school, he grew plants in the lobby. Every day when he came to school, the first thing he saw were his plants. With all the divisiveness in our country and during the pandemic, one of the things that's been most heartening for me is this. Almost every day I hear stories about kids and their families through their places of worship or through charities helping others, raising money for first responders, raising money for food banks. This gets to personal control because, see, if you feel there's something positive you could do, it really then helps you to be resilient. And what I realized is too often we preach to kids, you've got to be more caring and responsible. Provide them with opportunities to be more caring and responsible. And that's why this whole notion of what I call charitable or contributory activities really also is teaching kids to be compassionate and caring. There's also wonderful research. I mean, there's a whole body of research shows that high school kids, I'll call them quotes, at-risk high school kids, almost ready to drop out, are less likely to drop out if you ask them to read to younger kids 2 hours a week, go down to the elementary school. And what it really said to me is we all want to feel that we can make a difference. And it doesn't matter the age. There's research with people in their 80s and 90s, if they feel they're even doing an hour a week of some kind of voluntary work, how it helps them. And I'm not asking any of your listeners to say, okay, I'm going to volunteer 100 hours a week because hell, you burn out. But think about, as a family, what is the charitable work? How are you helping others? How are you making a positive difference in this world? And this has been a topic I've been writing a great deal about in terms of compassion and responsibility, because my whole model of resilience is not just that you're going to, that you handle adversity, but my whole model is you're strengthening yourself to handle adversity. And one of the ways is when you make a difference in the life of others. Research to show you actually feel less stressed when you do that. So I'm glad that question came up because it's one I have really been focusing a great deal about.
Right, absolutely. I totally agree with you. So I just have one final question. I am going to begin putting some items in the chat section while you are thinking about this question and answering this question. I will be adding the Google survey for you to complete. It just has a few questions to share your feedback. It's very important to us to find out how you enjoyed this program, and if there's anything that you would like us to focus on in the future or touch base with you further and follow up on, you can add that to the survey. I'm also going to put Dr. Brooks' website address in the chat. I will, at the conclusion of our discussion, I will go on there and show you. He has a huge, vast resource bank of many topics that if you are interested in diving deeper, you can take a look into. So I'm going to start to pop those in, but here is a final question for you, Dr. Brooks. It's been lovely talking to you. So, we have these ideas that we talked about: compassion, empathy, charismatic adults. What thoughts could you share with us about how we can create lasting memories for our children and the role these memories could serve in strengthening their resilience as they grow?
I'm glad we're ending that question because I started to ask myself, what are those memories? What are those moments? And, we've basically been talking about it. And they could be so simple and so powerful. So I'm just going to take a few minutes actually to share with you why they became so important to me by telling you a very personal story about the last words one of my charismatic adults, my father, ever said to me before he died. And then you'll see why I'm telling the story. Just tell you a little about myself, Stacy. I'm the youngest of 4 sons. Both my parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. And I grew up in Brooklyn. I've mentioned New York a couple of times. And, looking back, at the time, I felt very comfortable being with my parents. But looking back, I realized I was very blessed to have 2 of the most charismatic adults you could have as parents, very loving. And some people have said to me, just like you asked, well, what are some things you remember? One of the things I remember very clearly is my parents kept a file on me and my 3 brothers, not for the FBI or CIA file. Everything went in the
file. Wait, what kind of file are we talking about?
We're talking about, with them, it wasn't like a real file cabinet. It was almost like a box. Report cards, drawings. I love to draw. When I was a kid, I did my own cartoons. Anytime I did a cartoon or drawing, I would show it to my parents. They're wise enough not to say a future Picasso, but you know what they would always say? Let's save this. Let's put it in your file. I had no idea if the other 2 million or whatever people in Brooklyn, New York had files. I did. I thought we were kind of special. And I just remember this now to tell you the story. So My mother died at a relatively young age and suddenly. And I still remember after the funeral, my father, my brothers, and our wives were sitting around. And, we were certainly mourning the loss of someone who was so important. And at one point, my father, who was this very, I'll say simple, not simplistic, simple man, didn't have an easy life. He was the oldest son. I wrote about him, actually, one of my website articles about his coming to America. He said to me and my brothers, it's like yesterday, he said, boys, those files were very important to your mom. What you may not realize, they're just as important to me. So if it's okay in her memory, I would like to keep the files going. We teared up again. Here's this, he was 76 at the time, and he wants to keep the files going. In unison, we said, keep the files going. My father kept those files going for the next 10 years. Ironically or coincidentally, my father died one day apart from the 10th anniversary of my mother's death. And I want to share with you and the audience, and you'll see why, the last words he ever said to me. He had moved from New York to Florida. My wife and I were vacationing in Florida. And when it came time for us to go back to Boston, as he always did, my father was a hugger. By the way, where I grew up in Brooklyn, everyone hugged. And my father had this philosophy. He never said it to me. He modeled it. He felt that if there are opportunities to build other people up, your children, your partner, spouse, colleagues, don't lose that opportunity. So we were saying goodbye in Florida, getting ready to, my wife and I, to return to Boston, and my father hugged and kissed me. And he said something to me, those indelible memories, that was so incredible that on the flight back to Boston, I'm going to tell the audience what it was in a moment. On the flight back to Boston, I must have said 50, 60 times to myself, I am blessed. He is my father, what he just said to me. But you never know when it's going to be the last words, the last hug, or the last kiss. Just 2 days later, my brother, who lives in Florida, called and he said, Bobby, get down here quickly. I said, what is it? He said, Dad took ill very suddenly. Just get down here. And my first thought was, he can't be that sick. I just saw him 2 days ago. Talk about denial. I take the next flight. By the time I got there, my brother is at the airport, totally red-eyed. He said, Dad is comatose. They don't expect him to live through the night. And we have him, he's in a hospice. We race over to the hospice. I know a number of the listeners have experienced this. And me and my brothers each went in alone and held our father, and we said our goodbyes. And although they told me it was comatose, maybe I just want to believe this. I think he heard every word we said, because I knew he was going to die soon, but it was just a few minutes after we all said goodbye that the nurse came out and said he's peacefully died. And it was like his sons came, they said goodbye, and he could go. So what were his last words just a few days earlier? Now, this is the important thing. He never knew these were going to be his last words. But my father, again, had this philosophy: don't let these moments where you can build others up. He was a true charismatic adult go by. So these were his very last words to me at the airport. He said, now, Bobby, remember, when you get back to Boston, if you have anything you could send me for the file, please do. I always enjoy receiving things from you and hearing from you. I love you so dearly. You are so special to me. Stacy, I never heard another word, but what a gift he gave me. And what I'm going to say to all the listeners, don't let those moments go by. My father never sat down and said, you've got to do this. You got to make people feel better. But he modeled it. Find those opportunities, because that's what resilience is all about. What a gift. And, it was because of that and some other experiences that I said, don't let these moments go by. It wasn't, you have these Hollywood movies, someone is going to die and they say, oh, I got to, say goodbye to different people, whatever. Think about those precious moments, because I will say this, kids will remember those moments. And it could be as simple as taking your kid out on Wednesdays to dinner, and then when they're in college and coming home and saying, are we still going to do these things? But with my father, it was much more powerful. So I started writing about the indelible memories we create as parents or teachers or other caregivers. And that's what resilience there really is. It's rooted in the relationship, in those positive moments.
Right. And thank you for sharing that very special moment.
Thank you.
You had with your father. And I think it points back to that it doesn't have to be this gigantic event. It's these little things that make such a big difference. Yes. Well, I've lived it, and that's why I shared that particular story. It was just a brief
encountered. Of course, it was based on my whole relation with my father, but the words,
That's so special, though.
Yeah.
So I do, before I go over to your website, I do have a question that came in from the audience
Sure.
about motivation, and we see this often. What do you do if a child is not interested in anything? How do you probe them to find something that they are interested in?
Okay, what I'm going to say here, again, this is one of those questions which I have to really would have to know much more information. I said to myself, like with my son, Rich, he's not motivated in anything. When he was not, but he was very motivated, just not in things in school. So, there could be that they're in fact, they're not motivated. Rich was president of the youth group in our town, and yet he wasn't doing work. Rich developed a computer program, a card that I use for kids with learning problems, but he was almost flunking computer programming in school. So what I would say to parents is, when we say they're not motivated, is it in certain areas or not? What are their passions? What are their particular interests? And why a child is not motivated? I once, it was really interesting. And if they go to my website, I have a number of articles on motivation that I hope will be helpful. It basically, the article said we should never say kids are not motivated. When we say they're not motivated, what we're really saying is they're not motivated to do what we would like them to do. And there was a wonderful concept called avoidance motivation, that often when we say they're not motivated, they're avoiding certain tasks. Like, let's say my kid's not motivated in school. And why do people avoid different tasks? One, they don't think they're going to do very well at that task. One, they're afraid they're going to fail or whatever. So I started saying, and again, there are articles about this on my website, I started to ask this question, not how do you motivate someone necessarily, but how do you lessen avoidance motivation? How do you lessen avoidance motivation in someone, a child or an adolescent who is using it? And that's why, in terms of what I found, like those kids, the high school kids who were ready to drop out of school, when they were asked to help read to younger kids, all of a sudden they had motivation for school because they felt they were serving a certain purpose. So it's a very complicated question. On my website, I also have a number of articles about the model of motivation I use that includes helping kids feel they really belong and are connected to the schools, that they have some say what's going on, that they really feel people are focusing on their islands of competence. I don't want to overly simplify it. I know I'm feeling a little rushed, but as I said, a number of the articles on my website really have to do with motivation, and they're in the titles of that in that regard.
I think this is a good time to just pop up your website to show everybody where they can find these articles. So here is Dr. Brooks' website. I put the link in the chat comment box, and I will also include this on our district website.
And they just have to click on articles.
Yep. So we click on, so if you go to the top, you can see that he has a lot of choices up here. And if we choose articles. You just have to click and. Yep.
There are, at this point, I started writing, I can't believe all the 20 years worth.
I was looking through. He has a very good collection of articles all the way back to 1999.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it.
Right. And if you open up if you push the plus next to the year, you can see that he has written an article each month for a very long time. So 23, we're just starting 2022. So I'll say 22 years and 1 month of articles for everybody to look at.
Since you have that open, I would say, because it's a whole other topic, the notion of gratitude, my November, December 2021 articles are also very related to resilience. And there's wonderful research, but it would be another half hour to go into. But it actually shows that when we think about what we're grateful for or express gratitude towards others, this is fascinating research, Stacy. It actually activates parts of the brain that have to do with well-being. So people can see also, as we're getting to learn what happens in the brain when we're engaged in certain activities, the findings are just fascinating. I'm not a brain researcher, but I'm glad there are people who are doing this kind of research.
Right. Awesome. And I think it's wonderful that you are pointing us to this if we are interested in in finding out some more information, on a variety of topics, but it's very valuable
Well, thank you.
resources. So thank you very much.
Well, it's talking about gratitude. I want to thank you again for inviting me and for being such a wonderful host.
Thank you. So I would also like to thank the audience for joining us for our second event of the Families Connect series. We are looking to have another event before the end of the school year, so stay tuned for details coming up on that. As I had mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, this is a recorded event and it will be hosted on our district website. If you go to the district website homepage, it is on the bottom left side, but also you can reach it directly at neshaminy.org/Families Connect. Thank you so much, Dr. Brooks, for joining us this evening and sharing your expertise with us. I really enjoyed our discussion, and I have received many wonderful comments about how valuable and how a lot of people have been able to connect with the information that you shared with us. So that is really wonderful, gift that you've given us, is that you've made this connection for us and helped us work through some of these things, especially
thank you.
Challenges of raising our children. So thank you so much. And I guess that, that's it. So thank you, everyone. I will be sending out another email with more information about our future events and where you can get some of the resources that we talked about tonight with Dr. Brooks. All right. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.